Now then we move on to 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 11. 2 Corinthians 1:11. We'll have to read from verse 9 through 11 in order to get the background. And here we have a completely different type of charisma mentioned in verse 11. Paul says this, and he's referring to a certain experience in his own missionary ministry. But we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raiseth the dead, who delivered us from so great a death, and doth deliver, in whom we trust that he will yet deliver us. Ye also helping together by prayer for us, that for the gift bestowed upon us by the means of many persons, thanks may be given by many on our behalf. The word gift in verse 11 is charisma. What is Paul referring to? A miraculous deliverance from extreme danger. And this is called a gift. It's a manifestation of God's grace. I have a feeling myself that Paul was possibly referring to the situation at Derbe, where he was stoned and left for dead, and then stood up and walked off as if nothing had happened. That was a grace gift. It was a supernatural intervention of God in divine grace, and it came in answer to the prayers of many. Whether that was the particular incident referred to here or not isn't important. What is important is to understand that a sudden, dramatic, supernatural intervention of God, contrary to all that normally we could expect, is a grace gift. It's a gift that's given of God's grace to meet the needs of a particular situation. And then in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 14, we have words of advice from Paul to Timothy, whom he called his son in the faith. 1 Timothy 4:14. Neglect not the gift that is in thee, which was given thee by prophecy, with the laying on of the hands of the presbytery, the elders. And in 2 Timothy 1:6, a very similar exhortation is given again. Wherefore I put thee in remembrance, that thou stir up the gift of God which is in thee by the putting on of my hands. It appears that Timothy was rather liable to allow timidity to keep him from exercising the gifts which God had given him. And so Paul found it necessary in each of these epistles to warn Timothy, don't let that gift lie dormant. Don't be content just to minister as if you didn't have this particular gift. Whatever gift it is that he's referring to, which is not immediately obvious, he says, stir it up. Don't neglect it. Use it. It was given you by God for his glory and to fulfill his purposes, and you're accountable for what you do with that. And this is true of many others too, that we are accountable for what we do with the grace gifts of God. And then finally, the last of these 17 instances is in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 10. 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 10. As every man hath received a gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Peter did not expect any Christians to be lacking in grace gifts. He expected that every man would receive gifts, and on the basis of what he would receive, he would be able to minister. If we haven't got anything, we can't minister anything. So if Christians are going to minister, they must first receive. I like the words of Peter and John when they met the lame man at the beautiful gate. Peter said, such as I have, give I unto thee. If you don't have it, you can't give it. That's the problem with large sections of the contemporary church. They have nothing to give in the first place. The preacher can preach at them and exhort them to do this and that, but if they have nothing to do it with, how can they do it? Peter expected every Christian to be in the position of having received grace gifts and being out of those that he had received able to minister to others. This is one of the basic problems the Christian church today. We're operating in the natural. We trust in education, background, social environment, and all these things. And therefore there are many people who say, well, I just don't have anything. I have nothing to give. But if they would let God move them out into the area where he would receive his grace gifts, which they don't have to earn, which they don't have to qualify for by education or training or seminary background or any of these things, then they would be in a position to minister to others. Now I want to summate a little of what we've gone through. This is contained in the outline. I think it won't be necessary now to go back to each reference, but only to look at some. I want you to see that the word charisma as we have studied it so far, is used of the following things. In Romans chapter 5, verses 15 and 16, it's applied twice to righteousness. In Romans chapter 6, verse 23, it's applied to eternal life. And then in Romans chapter 12, it's applied to 7 things. It might be good to look at Romans 12 together for a moment, just to see the 7 different charismata that are there mentioned by Paul. He says in Romans 12:6, having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, whether prophecy, or ministry, or he that teacheth, or he that exhorteth, he that giveth, he that ruleth, he that showeth mercy. If you summate those things, Paul gives, apparently as more or less random examples, 7 types of charisma. The first is prophecy, the gift of prophecy. The second is ministering. The Greek word means serving, primarily in the practical realm. It's the word that gives us deacon, which was essentially a form of service in the material and practical realm. Teaching, exhorting, giving. The Greek word is sharing, but it means sharing of our material substance, our finance, and showing mercy. I love to emphasize that showing mercy is a specific charisma. And there are millions of people in this miserable world that need someone to show them mercy. It's a charisma I think we could have a lot more of. Now, going on from there, in 1 Corinthians 7:7, Paul uses the word in a completely different kind of context of celibacy, the ability to live unmarried. This is another charisma. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 3 times, he applies it to healings, the gifts of healings. And then in chapter 12, verse 31, he applies it to another list, and I think we should look at that list for a moment. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 31, Paul says, covet earnestly the best gifts. Now, you have to take that in its context. And to do that, you have to go back to verse 28. And there, Paul says, God hath set some in the church. And then he specifies 8 specific functions or gifts or ministries in the church. Let's just read through them. Apostles, prophets, teachers, miracles, gifts of healings, helps, governments, diversities of tongues. So there we are given 8 specific examples. And then summing up his teaching about these 8 specific examples, Paul says, covet the best. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11, he speaks about charisma in the context of this miraculous intervention that apparently saved his life, that came in answer to the prayers of so many of God's people. Now, I want to go down to the bottom of the page, which will be the last material for this first study, and I want to summate as far as possible the different types of charisma that are actually referred to in the New Testament. You'll see the total that I come to is 25. People say that 5 is the number of divine grace. I don't quite know where they get that from, but it rather suits me because this is 5 squared. It's grace in every form, on every side, by every channel. And this is the word that I want to keep before you all the time, is the word grace. The riches of God's grace, the abundance of God's grace, the variety of God's grace. You know, God apparently has never made 2 snowflakes alike. That's almost unbelievable, isn't it? No 2 leaves on an oak tree are identical. And no 2 Christians need to be identical. God has got enough grace, He's got enough gifts, He's got enough variety, He's got enough abundance for all of us. And one of my main purposes in going into this in some detail is to try to get you stirred up to believe that God has got enough for you too. And if you're living in rather a narrow corner or on a rather a limited ration, remember God isn't rationing you. You're rationing yourself. Let's look then at the bottom of this first page of the outline at the different things that are referred to, some directly and some by inference. Now I'm at that list at the bottom of your first outline. Romans 5, 15 and 16, as we've already pointed out, righteousness is referred to. And I've put 1 in the right-hand margin because I'm adding up the totals. And in Romans 6:23, it's eternal life. That's another one. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8, 9, and 10, we have 9 charismata, the ones that I read at the beginning of this study. You remember what they were? The word of wisdom, the word of knowledge, faith, and so on. Going through, you'll find there are 9, and we're going to come back and study them in detail, so we'll not spend time on them now. Then, by putting together various different passages, we found that Paul talks about an apostle as a charisma, a prophet as a charisma, a teacher as a charisma. I believe, therefore, it's logical to deduce from this that all the main ministry gifts are also examples of charisma. Now, these gifts are actually specified in Ephesians chapter 4. We might turn and just look at that for a moment. There are 2 mentioned in Ephesians 4, which are not actually mentioned in the other list, but I believe logic demands that we consider them all to be examples of charisma. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11 gives us these 5 main ministry gifts set by God in the church through Jesus Christ, and they are normally referred to as the ministry gifts. Ephesians 4:11, he gave some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors or shepherds, and some teachers. 5. So we add the total 5 on the right-hand side beneath 9 for the 5 main ministry gifts. Then in Romans chapter 12, verses 6 through 8, which we have already looked at, we found that Paul mentioned the following: prophecy, ministering, I call it serving, teaching, exhorting, giving, ruling, showing mercy. Now you'll notice that I've put 2 in parentheses. Prophecy, because we've already counted it amongst the 9 spiritual gifts, and teaching, because we've already counted it amongst the 5 ministry gifts, so we don't count them in this list, because that would be counting the same thing twice. So 7 minus 2 gives us 5. You see the 5 in the right-hand margin there? Now in 1 Corinthians 7:7, we still have the one that Paul himself said he had and he wished others had, celibacy. We just give 1 for that. 1 Corinthians 12:28, we have a list that we have looked at, but perhaps it would be good to look at it once more. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 28, where we find the order in the local church. God hath set some in the church, first apostles, secondarily prophets, thirdly teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healings, helps, governments, diversities of tongues. Now there are altogether 8 that are listed there, but most of them have already been mentioned in one of the previous lists. So we put them in parenthesis, and let's see what we are left with. Now the first 3, apostles, prophets, and teachers, come from Ephesians 4:11, the 5 main ministry gifts. So we don't mention them again, or we don't count them again. Miracles and healings have been mentioned in the 9 spiritual gifts of 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Now helps has not been mentioned. I understand the ministry of help is the one who's willing to be an Indian to somebody else who is a chief. In some places, the problem is everybody wants to be chiefs and nobody wants to be Indians. Well, the ministry of helps is the man who can't be a chief but is willing to be a good Indian, and very desperately needed ministry in many places. And then there's government. We might say a word about that. It's taken directly from the Greek word for to steer. It does not mean ruling, because if it meant ruling, it would be illogical to put it after helps. It means the act of steering, of turning the rudder. And this is a ministry. It's just making one little move that changes the course of a group, the course of a meeting, or whatever it may be. It's a very fascinating charisma. Many, many times in a prayer meeting or a bigger meeting than that, we don't get the full purpose of God in the meeting, because at a certain point God wanted us to go one way, and we had our minds made up to go another. Well, we're going to sing choruses tonight. God didn't want us to sing choruses. God wanted us to do something different. or we're going to have a Bible study tonight. God called us to prayer, see? Now, the ministry of steerings is just indicating the way the meeting, the group should go, and turning the rudder so that it goes that way. It's a very, very fascinating ministry to observe. In the Journals of John Wesley, there's a very wonderful illustration of this ministry and its usefulness. It happened with the early Methodists, as it happened with some in our day, that having got blessed by God, they got turned out of the church. As you probably know, John Wesley was not allowed to preach in his father's church, although he was an ordained minister of the Anglican Church. He had to preach on his father's tombstone because they wouldn't let him inside his father's church. And there were various other places where the early Methodists were not allowed in the institutional church, so they had to go outside and find meeting places of their own. And in London, they met in a building that was primarily an armory used for storing arms, a large building in the center of London. One day, Wesley records in his journal that he and his brother Charles were there, and several hundred Methodists had gathered together, and a little insignificant sister suddenly stood up and said, "I feel we should move," and specified another building. And Wesley says, without a moment's hesitation or murmur or questioning, the whole group of several hundred people got up, filed out of that building, and went to the other building, having no natural reason for doing it. About 10 minutes after they left, there was an explosion in the basement of the other building which blew the building to pieces, and every one of those persons would have been killed. And we've never had the Methodist movement as we know it, or John and Charles Wesley as we know them, if it hadn't been for a little woman with the ministry of steerings who just turned the meeting the right way at the right moment. And you see, you come to your own experience. You can look back on many meetings, conventions and others, where we miss God's purpose because we aren't willing to have a steering in a direction that's different to what we expected. I was in a meeting once of a certain quite well-known full gospel group in a hotel, and God was really blessing. And at a certain point, God gave me a prophecy, which I really wasn't thinking, that if the people would come forward at that moment, God would save and God would heal. Well, they had an advertised speaker who'd flown a long way, and they'd paid his airfare, and I could almost read the thoughts going on in everybody's mind, and they thought, well, now, we paid this man's fare if we don't put him on to preach. So they said, well, we'll let Brother so-and-so preach, and then everybody come forward. Well, I tell you, when everybody came forward at the end, it was just as dead as could be, see? They'd missed the steering of God in that particular meeting. So I just comment on this government steerings because many people think it's the same as ruling, but it isn't. And I think the proof of that is that helps comes first and governments afterwards, whereas if it was ruling, ruling would come before helps. And then in the same list, we have diversities of tongues. Now, we have put a parenthesis around apostles, prophets, and teachers because we had them already in the main ministry gifts. We've put parenthesis around miracles and healings and diversities of tongues because we had them in the spiritual gifts. So we are left with the new ones, helps and governments. And then we come to 2 Corinthians 1:11, which we've already noticed, the miraculous intervention that came in answer to the prayers of God's people, saving Paul's life, apparently, and we add that up as one, and if my arithmetic is correct, you add those together, and we have a total of 25 distinctive charismata mentioned in the New Testament. Now, I wasn't actually planning on questions, but I've come to the end of the outline for this particular study. I don't want to begin on a new outline, and it could well be that I've said something that provoked question. And if you'd like to take the next 5 minutes or so to bring up questions or to clarify anything, because I've worked through a lot of material in a rather short space of time, and I could well understand that somewhere or other you weren't able to follow along. So if there's anybody that would like to just bring out a question now about anything that's troubling you, we'll take the next 5 minutes for that. If there's anybody that... Yes?
The change in the miraculous intervention.
Well, that would appear to be true. Let me repeat the question, because otherwise it won't come out so well on the tape. The question was about this last one mentioned at the bottom of the page, miraculous intervention of God. The question was, would that normally come rather in response to a group than to an individual? And certainly the context of Paul's remarks here would seem to confirm that. Because if we look in 2 Corinthians 1 for a moment, in the 11th verse where he uses the word, he says, "Ye also helping together by prayer for us, that for the gift bestowed upon us by the means of many persons, thanks may be given by many on our behalf." So it would seem that this miraculous intervention of God came as a result of prayers of many Christians. So here is a good confirmation of what has been suggested. This would come possibly more in response to the prayers of a group than as a manifestation in the life of some particular individual. I think another obvious example of divine miraculous intervention in answer to the prayer of a group is, of course, Peter being brought out of prison the night before he was due to be executed, which is recorded in Acts chapter 12. And there again, it was a group that was praying for Peter, and clearly this intervention of God must fall in the same category of a gift. It wasn't earned, it wasn't deserved, it was just the sovereign grace of God reaching down at the last moment to spare Peter's life. And I think that if we look at it this way, most of us can look back on something, sometime, which really meets the requirements to be called a charisma, a gift of God, a supernatural, miraculous intervention in answer to prayer. I believe, if I'm right, that General Eisenhower, as a small boy, had a condition in his leg which demanded amputation. And the doctor said there's no alternative but to amputate. But his family and friends prayed, his leg was spared. What was that? A divine supernatural intervention which gave the United States one of its great presidents and one of its great military commanders. You see, God has a purpose in what he does that goes beyond the particular immediate situation many times.
In our present...
Yes, I would. The question is, would I be able to give an example of showing mercy? Now, not all these gifts are dramatic and supernatural. That's the problem with many charismatic people. They're only looking for the dramatic and the supernatural, and consequently, their lives are very patchy. If you want an example of showing mercy, I say visiting shut-ins is one. How many, many lonely people there are, even in the city where we are tonight, Fort Lauderdale, even wealthy people, but lonely, longing for somebody to come and show them kindness. I remember a lady giving a testimony in the meeting when I was in that they opened in faith a little group of insignificant people in some city, I forget which it was, it doesn't matter. They announced that anybody that wanted prayer could call a certain number, they would pray. And they put this either in the newspaper or some way of communicating to people. The answers they got were fascinating. And it was a city where there was something of a race problem. One occasion, a Negro lady called, came, gave her problem, stated what was troubling her, and the ladies didn't know how to solve the problem, but they said, "At least we'll pray with you." And when they had prayed, this Negro lady said afterwards, "I never knew there was anybody that loved me enough to pray for me." So I would say that's another example of the ministry of showing mercy. And I believe this is a ministry that's greatly neglected. I believe there are possibly those of us here tonight. If we would seek God, say, "God, I want to do more for you than I'm doing. Isn't there a gift that you could give me?" It might not be the one you'd be looking for, see. But I certainly believe that's only one of many examples. There are many, many people that need to have mercy shown to them. We've received God's mercy, and we have an obligation to show God's mercy. One thing about the early church, I think you find if you study, they regularly took upon themselves the responsibility of caring for the poor. And in all the things we organize in most modern churches, we usually omit that completely. There are a few exceptions, but most modern churches will have a committee for everything except caring for the poor.
That was one of the gifts.
Yes. The question is to expound a little on the gift of celibacy. I would say that I always enjoy introducing this one because it usually startles people. And I rather enjoy this because I feel people get into a rut as to what they expect from God, and therefore they limit what God will do in their lives. It's perfectly clear that the Apostle Paul felt that God had set him apart for a particular ministry which required that he live a celibate life. I understand this, I believe it. He was very enthusiastic about it. He said, I would that all men were even as I myself. I don't know whether we'd all agree with that, but that's the way he felt. Now, I do believe this is a very valid manifestation of God's grace. And I'll say frankly, I used to think that the Roman Catholics didn't have much to teach the Protestants. But since I've come to know a good many Roman Catholics in this new charismatic movement, which is bringing us together, I've come to realize that most of the main teachings of the Catholic Church go back to something that has a valid scriptural basis, though it tends to become encrusted with tradition and maybe fossilized to the point where it is not fulfilling its function. And I don't believe in celibacy exactly the way that it's arranged in the modern Catholic Church, but I believe there is a genuine scriptural basis in the lives of some who have a special charisma. See, this is where we are different. Let me just point out that Jesus did say, and I think this is related to it, it's a difficult passage to expound, and I won't attempt to go into it in detail. He said, there'll be some that are born eunuchs, there are some that are made eunuchs of men, and there are some that have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God. That latter category, I suppose, was the category in which the Apostle Paul was found. But that's about the end of our time for this, and I appreciate the questions and your interest, which makes it so much easier to talk. Just keep praying for me that we'll produce something which will be a blessing to others.